When the shy waitress greeted the CEO's deaf mother, the air shifted. Her hands began to move, her eyes filled with something unspoken, and before anyone could breathe, the mother whispered through tears, "You remind me of her." Who was she talking about? This is what we are about to find out. Hello family. Welcome back to Heartwarming Stories. Before we begin, hit the subscribe button and comment where you are watching from so as not to miss out on any episode. Now let's dive in. Kelly Hoover's uniform fit neatly against her slender frame, her posture straight, her expression calm. She spoke little, smiled politely, and kept her distance from the world that ate and drank without ever noticing her. To most, she was just another face among the staff, another servant gliding through the golden haze. But her eyes told a different story. Behind them lived intelligence, exhaustion, and a secret she had carried too long. She didn't come here to be noticed. The Melrose Grill was her sanctuary, a place where she could disappear in plain sight. Each tray she carried, each table she served, was another day she survived without drawing attention to herself. The past had taken enough from her. She refused to let it take her peace too. But peace is fragile, and sometimes all it takes to shatter it is one small, unexpected moment. Hit th. At table 14, Brooke Perkins sat opposite his mother. He was the kind of man whose presence seemed to shape the air around him. Tall, composed, eyes sharp as if they'd measured everything in the room before settling on her. The CEO of Perkins Global Holdings, he was known for his brilliance, his control, and the icy distance he maintained even from those closest to him. His mother, Alice Perkins, sat with quiet elegance beside him. Silver hair pinned neatly, diamond earrings catching the warm light. Her blue eyes were alert, kind, and filled with a loneliness no one in that room could see. Alice was deaf, and her silence was the one thing Brooke had never been able to fix. Kelly approached with a tray of wine, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. She placed the glasses before them with practiced grace, bowed slightly, and turned to leave when she noticed Alice's hands move, subtle, expressive, trying to catch her son's attention. Brooke was too focused on his phone, scrolling through something urgent and unfeeling. Kelly hesitated. Years of training herself not to interfere clashed with the instinct that once defined her, empathy. The language Alice used wasn't unfamiliar. It was sign language. Precise, elegant, fluent. Before she could think, Kelly responded. Her hands rose in the air, shaping words she hadn't spoken in years. "Would you like more tea?" Alice froze, then smiled, a full, radiant smile that seemed to light the table. Her hands fluttered in excitement. "You sign." Kelly nodded. "I used to interpret." "You sign beautifully." Brooke looked up from his phone, startled. His eyes darted between his mother and the waitress, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Alice's laughter, silent but full of joy, filled the air like music only the heart could hear. For the first time that evening, Brooke Perkins didn't look like a man who owned the world. He looked like a man caught off guard by grace. The room seemed too quiet around them. Other guests glanced their way, curious about the sudden brightness that had entered the table where silence usually reigned. Kelly felt it too, the shift in atmosphere, the attention pressing in. She tried to step back to fade into the background again, but Alice caught her hand and signed quickly. "Thank you. You remind me of someone I once knew." Kelly smiled faintly. "It's an honor to serve you, ma'am." Her voice was soft but clear, trembling slightly as if she'd forgotten how to speak freely. She bowed, collected her tray, and turned to leave. Yet as she walked away, she felt Brooke's gaze follow her, heavy with curiosity. The moment should have ended there, a kind gesture between a stranger and a lonely woman. But fate had other plans. When Kelly reached the service hall, she paused against the wall, her breath shallow. Her hands still tingled from the signs she'd made. It had been years since she used them, years since she allowed herself to remember the life she left behind. The research, the lab, the betrayal. She closed her eyes, trying to push it back into the shadows where it belonged. In the dining room, Brooke watched his mother continue smiling long after the waitress had gone. Alice signed something quietly to him. He frowned, then spoke aloud. "She said that girl understands me better than anyone in this city." Brooke looked toward the kitchen doors where Kelly had disappeared, and for the first time in years, he couldn't shake a thought that refused to fade. Who is she? He didn't know that the answer would unravel his empire, expose his company's greatest secret, and change the course of all their lives forever. And Kelly didn't know that in reaching out with her hands, she had just reawakened the very past she had spent years running from. Before that night, Kelly Hoover had spent 3 years trying to disappear. But you can't hide from a past that speaks the language of your heart. The morning after the dinner at the Melrose Grill came gray and restless. A pale mist clung to the Manhattan skyline, softening its edges, but inside Brooke Perkins' penthouse, the air felt sharper than ever. He sat at the marble breakfast counter, untouched coffee cooling beside a half-open laptop. The night before kept replaying in his mind. His mother's laughter, the way that Waitress's hands had moved through the air like poetry, and the silence that had filled the restaurant when they began to communicate. Alice had been radiant. Brooke hadn't seen that expression on her face in years, not since before the accident that took her hearing. For so long she had existed in quiet patience, her words filtered through interpreters who turn her emotions into sterile translation. But last night, with that young waitress, she'd been alive again, expressive, free. He rubbed his temples. He should have been grateful, but something about it unsettled him. He had met hundreds of people through his mother's network of aides, interpreters, and caretakers, yet none had managed to connect with her that deeply. That waitress hadn't just known sign language. She understood the rhythm of it, the emotion behind every gesture. And that smile. He couldn't forget it. There had been something familiar about it, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't place. Across the counter, Alice sipped her tea and watched her son with a knowing expression. Her eyes sparkled mischievously as her hands began to move. "You're thinking about her," she signed, smiling. Brooke looked up. "About who?" "The waitress." "Kelly," Alice continued, the signs flowing elegantly. "She understood me better than anyone has in years." "She was kind," Brooke admitted carefully. "But you don't even know her." Alice's eyes softened. "I know what I felt. When someone sees you, you don't forget it." Brooke sighed. His mother's intuition had always been sharp. Too sharp, sometimes. He pushed his laptop aside. "I'll make sure the restaurant keeps her assigned to your table. You can see her again if you'd like." Alice chuckled silently, her fingers moving again. "Oh, I think fate will handle that, darling." He frowned. "You think fate works in restaurants now?" Her only answer was a grin and another graceful wave of her hand. "You'll see." Across town, Kelly Hoover pushed open the glass door to her apartment building, the morning wind biting at her cheeks. Her feet ached from the long shift, but her mind ached more. The city was loud. Car horns, sirens, the chatter of lives moving faster than hers. She tightened her coat around her shoulders and climbed the narrow staircase to her small third-floor apartment. The door creaked as she entered. Inside, the room was small but clean, though time had left its fingerprints everywhere. Yellowed textbooks stacked beside the bed, old research notes pinned to the wall, a broken laptop resting on a crate she used as a desk. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and on the nightstand sat a photo frame turned face down. She exhaled slowly, hanging her coat on the hook. The stillness of her home was both comforting and cruel. Last night had stirred something she had worked years to bury. The warmth of Alice's smile, the weight of Brooke's stare, it had all threatened to drag her back into a life she no longer claimed. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at her hands. They still remembered every motion, every word, every pattern she'd ever created. Even after all this time, the language of her past lived in her muscles. Her gaze drifted to a dusty stack of notebooks on the floor, labeled with black marker, Project Lucid. She hesitated, then reached for one. The cover crackled as she opened it, revealing pages of coded symbols, algorithmic sequences, and scribbled notes in the margins. At the top of one page were the words she had written 5 years ago. A system to translate intent, not just language. Her chest tightened. Back then, she had believed she was building something that could change the world. A program capable of interpreting emotion through gesture and speech patterns, meant to bridge the gap between the hearing and the deaf, between cultures, between people. It had been her dream. Her life's work. Until the day it was stolen. The memory came uninvited, vivid, sharp, and merciless. She was 27, standing in a glass-walled lab buzzing with quiet energy. The hum of computers filled the air as her team of linguists and data scientists worked under the blue glow of monitors. At the front of the room, Kelly stood before a holographic interface displaying thousands of language patterns connected by shimmering lines. "Project Lucid is live," she announced, her voice steady, proud. Cross-lingual recognition accuracy, 98%. Applause echoed through the lab. Her mentor, Dr. Alan Crawford, smiled from the corner, his gray eyes gleaming with approval. "You've done it, Kelly. The world will remember your name." And for a moment she believed him. Weeks later, it all fell apart. The government officials arrived without warning. Data was missing. Encrypted files had been transferred to an unauthorized source. Within hours, Kelly went from being the program's creator to its prime suspect. Her credentials were revoked, her lab shut down, her name dragged through headlines she could barely read through tears. Crawford vanished before the investigation began. By the time she realized he had framed her, it was too late. Project Lucid was sealed under federal security. Classified, buried, and unreachable. And Kelly Hoover disappeared with it. The notebook slipped from her hand, falling shut with a soft thud. She buried her face in her palms. The past had a way of chasing her down, no matter how many new names she wore or how quiet she became. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her back. 2 notifications blinked on the cracked screen. The first was from her landlord, rent past due, final notice. Pay by Friday or vacate. Kelly sighed. She'd already worked double shifts, and tips from even the wealthiest customers barely covered the bills. She swiped to the next message. An unknown number. No name. No subject line. Just 4 words. "You shouldn't have shown your hands last night." Her breath caught. For a moment she stared at the screen, waiting for it to vanish like a bad dream. But it didn't. The text sat there sharp and real. Her heart began to pound. She rose, pacing the narrow floor. It had to be a prank, someone from work who noticed her signing, maybe trying to scare her. But deep down she knew better. No one at the Melrose Grill knew her full name. No one knew where she lived. No one should have known she could sign like that. She turned off the phone and set it face down, trying to steady her breathing. The city sounds outside felt distant, muffled, as if the world had shrunk to the size of her small apartment. For the first time in years, she felt exposed. Her eyes drifted back to the photo frame on the table, the one she had kept face down since she moved in. Slowly, she picked it up and turned it over. Inside was a picture of her standing beside Dr. Crawford, both smiling, holding the first prototype of Project Lucid. She looked younger, fearless. Her throat tightened. She traced her finger across her younger self's smile, then whispered under her breath, "You really thought they'd let you change the world, didn't you?" Outside, a car horn blared. The moment broke. Kelly placed the photo face down again, shut the notebook, and forced herself to breathe. She told herself she'd imagined the message, that it was nothing. But the unease lingered, crawling up her spine like cold fingers. In another part of the city, Brooke Perkins stood at his office window, staring out over Manhattan. His reflection hovered against the skyline. Calm, controlled, but restless. He couldn't stop thinking about that waitress. About her composure, her precision, her poise. About the way she had connected with his mother in seconds, doing what years of professionals had failed to do. He picked up his phone, scrolled through his contacts, then paused. Finally, he called his assistant. "Find out everything you can about the Melrose Grill staff," he said quietly. specifically a waitress named Kelly. As he ended the call, a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe even concern, stirred behind his eyes. Back in her apartment, Kelly sat in the silence, staring at the dark screen of her phone, unaware that the man whose world would soon collide with hers had already started looking for her. The sun dipped behind the skyline, leaving the city washed in shadow. And somewhere deep inside her, Kelly felt it. The first whisper that the past she'd tried to bury wasn't finished with her yet. It had found her again. Brooke couldn't shake the image of her. The waitress. Not just her face, but the way her hands moved, the confidence in her gestures. There was something almost magnetic about the rhythm of her signing, something that made the air around her feel alive. He tapped his fingers against the mahogany desk in his office, his mind spinning. She was more than a server at a small cafe, and he had a gnawing need to know why. "Pull her file," he said quietly to his assistant, who raised an eyebrow at the command. "Miss Kelly Hoover," Brooks supplied. His voice had that calm authority that made people obey without question. The assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second before disappearing into the records room. Brooke leaned back in his chair, staring at the sunlight filtering through the tall office windows. When she had served Alice earlier, he hadn't seen a hint of hesitation. No small talk meant to appease customers, no clumsy gestures, every movement deliberate, precise. There was a discipline there he couldn't define, and it pulled at him like a magnet. The file came back quickly. Brooks scanned it with the practiced eye of someone used to reading between the lines. Too thin. Barely more than a few months' employment history at the cafe, no education details beyond a high school diploma, and no prior addresses, no previous jobs. It was as if Kelly Hoover had appeared out of nowhere. He felt a surge of curiosity he hadn't felt in years. Most people were predictable. They left traces, digital footprints, paper trails. This one had vanished into life as if she were reinventing herself daily. Brooke made a decision. Invite Alice to lunch. Again. The invitation went through immediately. Brooke knew that, as before, Kelly would be there, unobtrusive, quietly attentive. He wanted to see her again, not just as a waitress, but as the woman who seemed to carry a secret too heavy to speak aloud. Lunch arrived in a sunlit corner of a quiet, upscale bistro. Alice's eyes lit up when she saw him, her smile genuine, and Brooke felt the tension in the room ease. Kelly approached with her usual professionalism, yet Brooke's gaze lingered on her hands. He watched the precision, the clarity of her signing, the controlled grace that made him lean forward without realizing. Halfway through the meal, Alice reached into her bag and produced a small card. She handed it to Kelly with a shy but steady smile. Brooke watched as the waitress's eyes widened in surprise. "You gave me my voice back," Alice signed. Brooke had seen many forms of gratitude, but this was different. Kelly's hands moved across the air with fluid precision, almost reverent as she signed her acknowledgement. Each gesture was meticulous, measured. There was a story behind those movements, one that Brooke could almost feel if he closed his eyes. The moment passed and conversation continued, but Brooke's mind remained elsewhere. Every gesture, every subtle motion he had observed that afternoon, had left a mark on him. There was discipline in her signing, a sharpness and exactness that only came from years of rigorous practice. He had seen hobbyists and casual signers. This was something else entirely. That night, in the quiet of his penthouse office, Brooke returned to the trail he had begun to follow. He dug into databases, old archives, and hidden records, following threads that most people would never have the patience to pull. And then he found it, a report so deeply buried it was almost forgotten. Dr. Kelly Hoover, linguistic intelligence expert, accused of leaking government data, declared missing after a federal investigation. No further records. No trace. Brooke's pulse quickened. Could the waitress in his mother's cafe, the woman whose hands told stories she never spoke aloud, be the same Kelly Hoover? The woman whose life had vanished behind closed doors, whose name had been erased from public record. He stared at the screen, scrolling through the report, the words blurring as the implications took hold. If it was her, if she had really stepped out of a life so high profile, so dangerous, and now worked quietly in a cafe, the question wasn't just why. It was what had she been through? And more importantly, what had made her disappear so completely? Brooke leaned back, rubbing his temples. He knew the world of high-stakes intelligence and academic brilliance enough to understand one thing. Nothing in that file had been casual. Dr. Kelly Hoover was not someone who simply vanished. She had been forced to vanish, or she had chosen to vanish. Either way, the deliberate precision of her gestures at lunch suddenly made sense. Every motion she made, every minute detail of her signing, was training honed for survival, discipline, and control. He stared at the empty chair across the table where she had been. Somewhere, deep inside, he felt a dangerous curiosity stirring. He had to know more. He had to understand the woman who moved through life like a ghost with purpose, and whose quiet presence had left a louder impression than any voice ever could. The thought was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Brooke understood then that he was not dealing with a waitress. He was dealing with someone who had lived a life in the shadows, someone whose silence spoke louder than the world around her. And Brooke, despite every warning his instincts screamed, knew he would not rest until he uncovered the truth. Brooke waited in the corner of the quiet cafe, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. The place smelled faintly of roasted coffee and fresh pastries, familiar and grounding, yet today it felt like neutral ground for a confrontation he had been avoiding in his own mind. Kelly appeared precisely on time, moving with the same calm, almost studied grace he had observed before. She carried a tray as though it were part of her, the weight of it balanced perfectly in her hands. Her eyes lifted when she noticed him, polite but wary, and she set the tray down at a nearby table. Brooke stood and approached, his smile measured, soft, intentionally unthreatening. "Thank you for helping my mother the other day," he began, keeping his tone warm. "I wanted to express my appreciation personally." Kelly inclined her head, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "Of course," she signed, a practiced elegance in each gesture, her eyes never leaving his. Brooke seated himself opposite her, maintaining an air of casual conversation. But as the seconds passed, the questions that had been coiling in his mind began to break free. "Where did you learn to sign like that?" he asked, his voice lowering, sharpening ever so slightly. Kelly froze mid-breath. Her eyes flicked to his, a faint tightening around the corners. It's nothing special," she murmured, trying to dismiss it. He leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to close the small space between curiosity and truth. "It isn't nothing. I've never seen anyone with that kind of precision. You move like you've been trained." Kelly's hands twitched at her sides. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I work with what I have," she whispered, trying to redirect the conversation, subtly steering him back to safer territory. Brooke's gaze didn't waver. "And the cafe? Why hide behind a waitress's badge? Why not exist openly as you are?" A flicker of panic crossed her face, rapid and almost imperceptible. Her composure cracked for a heartbeat, a shuddered look in her eyes. She took a small step back, then steadied herself, forcing a casual calm over the storm beneath. "You wouldn't understand what it means to be erased," she said finally, her voice barely audible, a whisper almost carried away by the ambient noise of the cafe. Brooke opened his mouth, searching for a reply, some bridge to her truth, but before he could speak she turned and walked away. She moved as deliberately as she had always moved, yet every step was heavy with a weight he could not reach. He watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, leaving an echo of absence that resonated louder than words. Brooke returned to his car, unsettled, the drive home a blur of thought and unease. Every detail he had pieced together now felt like fragments of a puzzle he didn't yet know how to assemble. At his apartment, Alice noticed immediately. She was curled on the couch, her sketchpad open, but her attention was entirely on him. You look different, she said, tilting her head, sensing the tension he carried. Brooke sank into a chair, the weight of the afternoon pressing against him. Her name is Kelly Hoover, he said finally, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Alice's fingers moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the air with clarity. Brooke watched her sign. Then maybe the waitress isn't the one hiding. Maybe the world stopped listening. Her words struck him harder than he expected. The truth was no longer just about Kelly. It was about silence, about disappearance, about the way the world could ignore brilliance and survival alike, as if the mere act of noticing was an act of rebellion. Brooke sat back, digesting her words. A thought began to take shape, subtle but insistent. Perhaps this wasn't only Kelly's story. Perhaps it intersected with his own, with the decisions, the shadows, and the secrets buried within the walls of his company. He ran a hand over his forehead, the weight of suspicion pressing down. He had always prided himself on control, on the ability to predict outcomes, to read people. But Kelly's existence, her precision, and the silence around her, these had thrown him off balance. He realized that the closer he moved toward her truth, the more his own history began to feel like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Something from the past, something buried within his company, within his own family's legacy, was tangled up with Kelly's disappearance, with the erasure of her life. And for the first time, Brooke felt a rare, unnerving thrill. The chase was no longer just curiosity. It was personal. He looked out the window, the city lights beginning to flicker on, and knew that the next step would demand patience, strategy, and courage. He had to uncover Kelly's story, but more than that, he had to understand why someone of her brilliance had been forced to vanish from the world she had once inhabited. And somewhere deep down, he understood that uncovering the truth might expose more than just hers. It might expose his own. Brooke couldn't stop thinking about Kelly Hoover. The whisper of her words, "You wouldn't understand what it means to be erased," replayed in his mind like a warning. But what haunted him more was the gnawing sense that her erasure wasn't random. It had been engineered. Deliberately. He began his own quiet investigation, moving through the private corridors of Perkins Global as though he were walking a minefield. Files, archives, encrypted databases, all places he had access to but rarely explored. He knew the company's defense division housed secrets most people didn't even know existed. And if Kelly's disappearance and the precision of her work were connected, it would be there. Meanwhile, Kelly's life had grown more guarded. She noticed patterns that unsettled her. Fragments of her past algorithms resurfacing in places she hadn't touched in years. The most alarming discovery came late one night when she logged into an obscure server she had once helped design. Her hands froze over the keyboard. Project Hermes. The name should have meant nothing. But it did. This was her technology, her algorithms, the code she had painstakingly written to help the deaf communicate, to give voice to silence. Yet here it was, embedded in a defense project owned by Perkins Global, rebranded and weaponized. Fear gripped her. She had hidden for years, trying to make herself invisible. But now her creation had been turned into a tool she could no longer control. Her fingers trembled as she tried to trace the project's origin, every keystroke a pulse of dread. Brooke, following his own trail, confirmed her worst fears. Buried in Perkins Global's archives, he found the software blueprint, her code. Every pattern, every signature move, the exact mathematical fingerprints of Kelly's work, embedded in a defense application no one should have access to. And only one person could have done it. Ethan Ward, Brooke's vice president. Charismatic, controlled, always 2 steps ahead. But Brooke knew the signs. A theft this precise required access and trust, and Ethan had both. He confronted Ethan in the sterile, glass-walled conference room, letting the accusation hang in the air. "You know what I found," Brooke said evenly, not raising his voice. "Project Hermes. The code. It's hers." Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, expression calm. "You're reading too much into it," he said smoothly. "We're talking about hundreds of engineers, thousands of lines of code. Patterns repeat. Brooke's eyes narrowed. This pattern, it's hers. Unique. Only one person could have written it. And it didn't come from the defense team. Ethan's smile flickered. Just enough for Brooke to notice. I'd stop digging if I were you, he said quietly. Some things are better left buried. Brooke left the office with his gut knotted. This wasn't just corporate theft. It was a billion-dollar scandal waiting to explode. And Kelly, the quiet woman who had once waited tables, held the key to exposing it. That evening, Brooke drove across the city to find Kelly leaving the cafe. She was tucking her apron into her bag, the familiar calm about her tinged with exhaustion. She glanced up at him warily. I need to apologize, Brooke began as she paused. I came on too strong before. Kelly shook her head, starting to step past him. I can handle things, she signed, though the tension in her posture betrayed her uncertainty. Brooke held up a folder. I found it, he said simply. Your code. It's here. They stole it, Kelly. Project Hermes. It's yours, and they're using it wrong. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, the mask she wore began to crack. She tried to look away to maintain composure, but the weight of years of suppression began to surface. How do you know? She whispered, her voice fragile. Brooke opened the folder just enough for her to see the blueprint and coding patterns, the fingerprints unmistakably hers. He didn't speak. He let the evidence do the work. Her body trembled. The years of fear, hiding, and erasure came flooding back. She dropped to a chair, hands covering her face, and Brooke remained beside her, steady, patient, offering presence instead of words. I thought I'd lost it all, she admitted, barely audible. Everything I worked for gone. And now they're using it as a weapon. Brooke nodded, the resolve in his chest hardening. You haven't lost it, he said firmly. Not yet. And you won't, not while I can help. For the first time in years, Kelly let herself be vulnerable. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, I didn't know who I could trust. Brooke placed a hand lightly on the folder. Start trusting me now. Together we fix this. And we expose them. Kelly looked up at him, searching his expression for duplicity, but all she saw was determination. Tentatively she nodded, her hands still trembling but no longer trying to shield herself from the world. Brooke realized then that this was more than a fight for justice. It was a reclamation of life, of identity, of the power her code had always represented. And he would not let her reclaim it alone. The night air wrapped around them as they stepped into the quiet street outside the cafe. For Kelly, it was terrifying to step back into a world that had erased her. But for Brooke, the thrill of uncovering truth had never felt more urgent. They were standing at the edge of a scandal that could topple empires, and Kelly was the keystone. For the first time, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together. And Brooke understood that their battle had only just begun. Brooke watched the city lights shimmer through the towering glass of Perkins Tower as he and Kelly leaned over the labyrinth of code sprawled across multiple screens. The office was deserted, save for them and the faint hum of the servers. For Brooke, nights like this had always meant strategy, numbers, and control. But tonight, it meant something different. Partnership. Kelly's fingers moved deftly over her keyboard, tracing patterns, correcting anomalies. Brooke leaned in, trying to follow her movements, asking questions in a quiet, measured voice. She paused, glancing up at him. You don't need to understand all of it, she signed quickly, then spoke the translation. Just follow the logic. Patterns tell the story. Brooke nodded, absorbing the rhythm of her work, the precision of her thinking. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. They moved through contracts, traced coding signatures, dug into permissions and access logs, hours melting into each other as they pieced together the threads Ethan had tried to bury. At some point, Kelly paused and looked at him. You're fast, she signed, then smiled faintly. Want to learn a little? Brooke raised an eyebrow. Sign language. She nodded, demonstrating slowly. Hello, good, thank you. Her fingers moved gracefully, each gesture deliberate, teaching him not just the signs, but the patience required to express meaning in silence. He mimicked her awkwardly at first, fumbling over the shapes, but she laughed, a sound he hadn't realized he wanted to hear. The corner of his hard exterior softened a fraction. By the end of the night, he could sign a small, imperfect "thank you." The subtle shift didn't go unnoticed. Alice, observant and intuitive, noticed it almost immediately. When Brooke returned home the following evening, Alice was perched on the couch, sketchpad forgotten, eyes curious. "You're lighter," she said, signing slowly, then speaking the translation. "Kelly's influence?" Brooke hesitated but nodded. Alice smiled knowingly, her fingers sketching in the air. Then she should come over for dinner. She brought laughter back into this home. It's time to thank her. A few nights later, Kelly stepped into Brooke's apartment, tentative, her calm professionalism still in place, but her eyes softening in the warmth of the space. Alice greeted her with enthusiasm, showing her drawings, sharing stories, and for the first time, Kelly allowed herself to relax. The three of them ate together, laughter spilling between bites, and Brooke felt something unfamiliar: family. But the world outside their small bubble was growing more dangerous. Ethan had not stayed idle. Kelly began noticing shadows following her, small anomalies. Cars parked too long, figures that lingered too long at street corners. She tried to dismiss them, but fear curled in her stomach with every glance over her shoulder. Then, one night, she returned to her apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Heart racing, she entered, breath catching in her throat. The place had been searched, disrupted. On her bathroom mirror, written in bold, chilling letters: "Stop signing, or disappear again." Her hands shook as she touched the words. Memories of being erased, of disappearing into nothing, surged back with full force. She backed away, panic rising. She needed help, and there was only one person she could trust. Brooke arrived within the hour, moving swiftly and decisively. The look in his eyes told her he understood every nuance of fear she had carried for years. "You're not safe here," he said firmly. "Not tonight." Within minutes, he had moved her into a secure suite in the tower. High above the city, isolated, protected. A place of concrete safety and glass walls, but one where Brooke could watch over her without intruding. "They silenced you once," he said as she settled in, her hands trembling slightly. "Not this time. Not ever again." Kelly looked up at him, vulnerability etched into her features. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it. That someone would fight for her, protect her, and trust her. She nodded silently, the weight of her fear mixing with a fragile glimmer of hope. Brooke lingered at the doorway, surveying her secure surroundings. This was more than protection, it was strategy. Together, they would reclaim what had been stolen and expose the truth. But as the city lights flickered below, he felt the tension coiling tighter. Ethan's reach was long, his ambition ruthless, and the threats were only just beginning. Yet Brooke's resolve had never been firmer. Kelly was no longer alone, and he would make sure that this time, nothing and no one could erase her from the world again. The city glittered beneath the night sky, its streets alive with anticipation and headlights streaming like veins of liquid gold. Inside the grand ballroom of the Perkins Global Charity Gala, chandeliers gleamed with a brilliance that could rival the stars, casting patterns of light across polished marble floors and sharply dressed guests. This was a night designed to celebrate innovation, inclusion, and the image Perkins Global wanted the world to see. But behind the smiles and clinking glasses, a different kind of reckoning was brewing. Alice, radiant in a soft lavender gown, was poised to take the stage as guest of honor. Brooke watched her from across the room, every bit the composed CEO, but his mind was far from the gala's theatrics. He had spent weeks building the case against Ethan, assembling indisputable proof of theft and corruption, threading together contracts, emails, coding signatures, and hidden transfers. Tonight, all that work would come to light, but only if he trusted the one person whose voice had been silenced for years. Kelly hovered near the edge of the ballroom, her black dress understated, her eyes alert. Brooke approached her, concern etched on his face. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "It's too risky. Ethan will know something is off immediately if you're near the stage." Kelly met his gaze, her hands folding in front of her. She signed slowly, deliberately, before speaking the translation aloud. The truth must be spoken in the same hands that were silenced. Brooke's chest tightened. Her conviction was absolute. He knew she was right. If Alice's words were to carry their full weight, Kelly had to be the interpreter. The irony was sharp. The woman who had once been erased from her world would now amplify its voice. The gala's orchestra began a gentle prelude as Alice was announced. Cameras swiveled, flashbulbs popped, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brooke's eyes scanned the room, landing on Ethan, who stood with effortless charm, laughing politely, exuding the calm confidence of someone certain of control. But Brooke knew better. Ethan had no idea the trap that had been set. Alice stepped onto the stage, the spotlight capturing her every movement. Brooke watched from the sidelines, his heart rate steady but his awareness heightened. Kelly joined her, standing slightly to the side, hands ready to translate every word with precision. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Alice began her speech, a careful balance of gratitude and advocacy. She praised the organization for fostering innovation, highlighting initiatives for accessibility and inclusion. But every word she spoke was mirrored by Kelly's hands, flowing across the air with a grace and clarity that captivated the audience. Brooke's gaze flicked to Ethan again. The VP's smile remained, but a flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. He sensed something shifting, though he couldn't yet pinpoint it. As Alice moved deeper into her speech, she shifted subtly, signaling more than just pleasantries. Her words became sharper, pointed, a celebration of transparency, ethics, and accountability. Kelly's hands mirrored each nuance perfectly, amplifying the meaning behind the carefully chosen language. Every guest in the room, every journalist watching from cameras, was now receiving the message in two voices. One spoken, one signed, with deliberate intent. Brooke felt the tension coil tighter. He had hidden the final piece of evidence in a tablet discreetly positioned at the lectern. A secure file that documented the theft of Kelly's code, linking it directly to Ethan. The world had eyes on the stage, but no one suspected the revelation waiting to unfold. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Cameras pivoted, reporters whispered urgently, and a few executives began exchanging glances. Ethan's confidence wavered. Brooke could see the subtle twitch in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edges of his suit jacket. He had not anticipated this orchestration, the meticulous alignment of truth and presentation. Alice, calm and poised, reached the climax of her speech. The final words were deliberate, highlighting the importance of accountability and transparency in leadership, and calling for recognition of those whose contributions had been ignored or stolen. Kelly's hands flew across the air, translating every word with unflinching precision. Every gesture resonated with authenticity, carrying a weight that silenced the room. Brooke knew that tonight's performance wasn't just about exposing Ethan. It was about restoring balance, reclaiming stolen voices, and proving that brilliance and integrity could not be buried indefinitely. Ethan, now visibly unsettled, tried to regain composure, forcing a polite smile as whispers of recognition and astonishment swept through the crowd. Some executives exchanged discreet glances, journalists leaned closer, and a subtle shift in perception began to ripple outward. Brooke allowed himself a measured breath. This was only the first step. The stage was set, the audience attentive, and the evidence secure. But most importantly, Kelly's presence was undeniable. She was no longer invisible, no longer erased. Every sign, every gesture, every precise movement of her hands conveyed not only the truth but the triumph of reclamation. As the applause began, Brooke's gaze softened slightly. He glanced at Alice, who returned a proud, knowing smile. Then he looked at Kelly. Her hands, which had once trembled under fear and the weight of erasure, now moved with authority, translating truth into something tangible, something undeniable. Tonight, masks were worn, lights dazzled and whispers filled the air. But the most powerful presence in a room wasn't the glimmering chandeliers, the elegantly dressed patrons, or even Ethan's forced charm. It was Kelly Hoover, standing at the intersection of courage and revelation, turning silence into action. Brooke felt a surge of relief and determination. This was the turning point. The world had begun to listen. The gala's chandeliers sparkled like frozen fireworks, but the energy in the room had shifted. Gone were the polite murmurs and champagne-laced laughter. Replaced now was a charged silence, the kind that follows an unexpected revelation. Kelly's hands continued their graceful translation, but the weight behind them had deepened. Every gesture carried years of stolen work, quiet suppression, and finally defiance. This company's greatest innovation was built on a stolen dream, Kelly signed. Each movement deliberate, precise, and impossible to ignore. The words echoed through the ballroom before they even reached the microphones, reverberating in the minds of executives, guests, and reporters alike. Forks hovered midair, eyes widened, and whispers died instantly. Kelly's hands moved fluidly, explaining how her algorithms, once intended to give the deaf community access, education, and voice, had been appropriated, twisted into a defense project, and weaponized under the name Project Hermes. She signed the journey of her stolen work, the erasure of her contributions, and the years she had spent hiding to survive. Each word, each gesture, was a claim of ownership, justice, and reclamation. Brooke's eyes scanned the audience. Cameras tilted, capturing every motion. Reporters scribbled furiously. Executives who had laughed moments before now shifted in their seats, some with disbelief, others with thinly veiled panic. And then he saw Ethan. The VP's confident mask crumbled. His lips parted, his hand shot toward the microphone, and he bellowed, "That's a lie. She's lying." Brooke didn't hesitate. He strode onto the stage, standing beside Kelly. "She's telling the truth," he said, voice calm but ironclad. "And I stand with her." The room went still. Cameras pivoted, capturing Brooke's stance and expression, every angle amplifying the confrontation. Ethan's mouth opened again, but this time his words felt hollow. The weight of Brooke's authority, paired with Kelly's undeniable proof, left him exposed. Alice rose beside them, her voice clear through sign language. "This woman gave me back my voice. It's time the world heard hers." Her hands were steady, a mirror to Kelly's, lending the speech both legitimacy and emotional gravity. The ballroom remained silent, but it wasn't discomfort, it was awe. People didn't just see, they absorbed the truth. Kelly's story wasn't just told, it was witnessed. Her stolen work, the years of erasure, and the courage to step into the light resonated with everyone present. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and phones recorded every frame. Social media accounts pinged with live updates, hashtags igniting across multiple platforms. Within minutes, Kelly Hoover's name was trending. Comments poured in, praising her bravery, condemning the theft, and marveling at the audacity of speaking truth in such a polished public forum. Ethan's face burned with humiliation. He attempted to regain control, waving a hand and shouting for the attention of the room, but it was too late. The narrative had shifted. Public opinion, recorded footage, and Brooke's open declaration made denial impossible. Every executive who had previously turned a blind eye now felt the tremor of accountability beneath their polished shoes. Brooke's gaze softened as he looked at Kelly. Her hands were steady now, finishing the final signs of her narrative. Relief, exhaustion, and triumph all mingled in her expression. She had faced years of fear and finally reclaimed her voice on the largest stage imaginable. Alice smiled at both of them, her gratitude clear. "We did it," Brooke whispered, though his eyes never left Kelly. Outside the gala, reporters crowded around every exit, eager for statements, while flashes continued to light up the night like a storm of stars. By the time Brooke and Kelly left the ballroom, the story had already begun to dominate news cycles. Perkins Global's narrative had fractured, Ethan's credibility lay in ruins, and the stolen technology's history was no longer hidden. Kelly paused on the steps, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The city seemed alive, buzzing with the electricity of revelation. She looked at Brooke. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, her hands brushing the edges of her dress. "But it feels right. Finally. It feels right." Brooke nodded. "The world is listening now. And this time no one can silence you." Kelly allowed herself a small, tentative smile, one that hinted at the relief, pride, and power she had carried silently for so long. Brooke watched as the city lights reflected in her eyes, a mirror to the journey she had endured and the truth she had finally reclaimed. This was more than exposure, more than vindication. It was a reclamation of life, identity, and voice. And as the flashbulbs continued to pop, capturing her every gesture, Brooke knew that the story was far from over. But for the first time in years, Kelly Hoover had stepped fully into the light, unafraid and unstoppable. Months had passed since the gala that had exposed Ethan Ward and reshaped the narrative of Perkins Global. The city had healed its scandalous wounds, but for Kelly Hoover, the healing was personal. The woman who had once been erased now stood fully in her own light, and her work was no longer hidden or misused. Kelly and Brooke had launched Hoover Perkins Innovations, a company dedicated to ethical technology, accessibility, and inclusion. The office was alive with energy, sunlight streaming through the glass walls, reflecting off polished desks lined with monitors, blueprints, and flowering plants. Alice served as honorary chairwoman, her presence a warm constant, her office lined with awards, flowers, and sketches of technological projects. She smiled as she watched the team collaborate, proud of the family and legacy that had blossomed before her eyes. Kelly had transformed. The shy waitress who had once moved quietly through a cafe now commanded conference rooms, spoke at industry panels, and mentored young women in tech. Her signature grace in signing had become her voice on the world stage. Patents bore her name boldly, her intellectual property reclaimed, her contributions recognized. She moved with confidence, her hands tracing invisible lines of authority and compassion alike. One quiet evening, the city stretched out beneath them in a glittering panorama as Kelly and Brooke stood on the balcony of their office. The Manhattan skyline twinkled like a constellation of voices finally heard. The wind was gentle, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. Brooke broke the silence, his voice low and earnest. "You taught me what leadership really means." Kelly looked at him, her fingers poised. Slowly, deliberately, she signed back, "And you taught me to be seen again." The moment held, a balance of past and present, fear and courage, silence and expression. Below, the city lights flickered as if reflecting every story, every voice that had finally broken through the noise. The work at Hoover Perkins Innovations continued, but the evenings became moments of reflection, of quiet victories. Kelly often thought of the years she had spent hiding, the nights of fear, the moments of erasure. Now, each sign she made, each patent she filed, was a declaration. She existed, she mattered, and no one could take her voice again. And then there was the place that had started it all. The Melrose Grill. The golden glow of the restaurant filled the room as it had years ago, but now the space carried laughter, warmth, and stories untethered by fear. Brooke, Kelly, and Alice shared a quiet dinner, the table alive with conversation and playful gestures. Kelly signed as she spoke, Alice responded, and Brooke leaned back, letting the connection between them ripple quietly through the moment. The world outside might have seen a CEO, a waitress, a mother. But in that glow they were something more, proof that compassion, persistence, and courage could transcend titles, wealth, and fear. Every gesture, every laugh, every shared glance was a reminder that voices, once silenced, could be restored. As dessert plates were cleared and the evening mellowed, Kelly traced the edge of the table with her fingers, looking around at the warm, familiar faces. She realized, with a soft exhale, that she had finally found her place in the world. Not hidden, not erased, but fully visible. Brooke reached across the table, offering a quiet smile, and Alice chuckled softly, signing a playful comment about the dessert. The three of them shared the moment in silence and sound. Words and signs intertwined seamlessly. Laughter, signing, and warmth flowed across the table like a current. carrying more meaning than any single voice could ever convey. Outside, the city continued to shimmer, indifferent yet illuminated. But inside the glow of the Melrose Grill, the world had shifted. Here, in this room, 3 lives converged, past sorrows acknowledged, present triumphs celebrated, and futures reclaimed. The lights flickered like voices finally heard, like stories finally told, like lives restored. And in that golden glow, Kelly Hoover, Brooke, and Alice understood something fundamental. The truest language of all was compassion, the kind that saw, listened, and honored every voice. For the first time, the world saw them as they truly were, not defined by fear, wealth, or status, but by courage, resilience, and the power of being heard.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.